Hi, and welcome to this episode of What's the Risk? I'm Charlene. For those of you that are new here, I first want to take a minute before we get started with this episode and encourage you to go over to our YouTube channel, because what my team and I have been doing for the last 2 months, every week we've pulled a cyber attack out of the news, and we've been breaking them down, explaining exactly how the attacks are occurring, how they're able to get into the networks, how they're able to stay in the networks. And then from there, we are putting together best practices. And then, of course, we're going and quantifying the risk and showing you exactly how to do that. So if this is your first time with us, I would encourage you to go over there, take a look at those. There's a ton of really good educational material there. So this particular episode, I decided to do something a little different. After we did 8 of these episodes looking at a variety of different attacks, I thought, let's do an episode that starts to deal with one of the core reasons, one of the root causes why we're seeing so many of these attacks, and why they're so prevalent, and they seem to be increasing, and in fact, they are increasing, and there's a number of reasons why. We can have a whole other conversation about that. But what I wanted to do this time was focus on one of the root causes, which is how we do patch management. Because one of the primary reasons that these attacks are able to be as successful as they are is because once an attacker gets into the network, they live off the land. And what they're doing is they're leveraging what I call exploitable vulnerabilities that already exist in the network. And so that's what I wanted to focus on. That's why I put this package together, was to really kind of engage in this conversation with the community and share with you some of the work that I have done, some of the tools that we have that really address this issue, because I just don't think that this is something that we as a community have these kinds of tools. I know that when I have been doing this work for, oh my gosh, the last 4 years, I had to create tools in order to do this work. And that's time consuming and it can be difficult. And so I really wanted to kind of share some of that information, the why that I did this, how I put it together, and just share that with the community. So we'll get started in just a few minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little presentation with you and kind of walk through some of the problems and then explain what I think is a better way to go about doing this. I've certainly seen the impact that this kind of analysis can do, and it really doesn't take long. It really doesn't take long. It's very quick. And that was one thing that I really liked, because in my work, I have to do a great deal of analysis, and I'm looking at very large data sets, and I needed something that was really fast, easy to use, very flexible, and something that I could use in reporting these findings up, because it's one thing to do the work, but then you also have to communicate that work. And so I needed something that would give me the ability to easily report this up in a number of ways. And so that means having the ability to not only present data in tables, but also being able to chart it, presentations, that sort of thing. So we'll get started now. And then the last thing that I will ask is, I'm a little shorthanded today. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And then what I will do is, as I kind of break between the presentation, I have a small demonstration I'd like to give you. And then I have something for you at the end that I also want to share with you, a file that I want to share with you. So I'll take a break between these if there are any questions. Great, so let me just get started. Great. Okay, so in this presentation, I really just want to, as I said, kind of focus on the vulnerability management piece of this and how we can improve it. Most organizations already have some form of vulnerability management. I get that. Depending on the size of the organization, though, that might look different. So if you're a very small company, 50 to 100 people, something like this, maybe even up to 200 or 250 or in that range, your vulnerability management process is going to look very different than once you're at about a 250 people size and up. And then once you start to have multiple offices, you become international and you're much larger, it looks very different again. So there are kind of 3 growth phases that most organizations go through on this. But we hope that everybody has something in place. And most of them have this kind of a process. It's going to look something like this. Patches are released. Hopefully you're doing some minimal testing, and most of that testing is really operational. You're checking to make sure that the patches you put on don't break anything in your operational environment. And then most operations use the CVSS score to prioritize. So for anybody who's kind of new to this space, I'll just do a quick little explanation. So whenever vendors find a vulnerability, that vulnerability gets posted on a website called National Vulnerability Database. If you haven't looked at it, go Google it, National Vulnerability Database. And what you'll find there is that all of the vendors, when a vulnerability is discovered, they release it. And there's some data that they give when they release it. One of the things they do is they give it a CVE number, that's a number. They give it a description. And then they will also create the CVSS score, which is a way of ranking how severe they think that vulnerability is. The problem with that, though, is that CVSS score is the vendor telling you the impact that has to their system. They don't know, and there's no way that they could tell you what the impact of that is to your environment. And this is part of where a lot of vulnerability management that we are doing as a community needs to improve. That piece where we are saying, what's the impact inside my organization? That really makes a difference. And that's part of what's wrong or broken right now, and that we need to start addressing. Within the CVSS standard itself, it gives you an option of how to make that relatable to your organization. But here's the problem. Once an organization has 100 people or more, 250, you kind of pass that mark, you just don't have time to do any real customization. You are on that treadmill constantly patching and updating every month. And so that piece just doesn't get done. And so what most people do is they just take the CVSS score, which is in version 3.0, it's a 5 points. You've got critical, very high, moderate, right? And they go for the criticals first. They try and get all the criticals done, then they go for all the highs. And then if they have time, they get some of the mediums. Well, here's the problem. You're only really getting maybe 80%. And by the time they get all this done, it's time to start dealing with user issues that something caused a conflict, somebody's got a question, something had a one-off configuration, something happened, they have to start dealing with the user issues. And then the next thing you know, the cycle starts all over again. And the bigger the organization, the more applications and software and everything you have. So that patch release cycle is slightly different depending upon which vendor you have. So it really is time consuming and difficult. So that's the typical sequence. The problem is we have limited resources. It would be nice if we all had unlimited resources and we had all the people and the money and the resources we wanted to resolve this problem, but that's not the case. And it's not getting any better, right? It's a problem that is increasing over time. And in the typical process, what I would like to talk about changing is that where we're currently doing minimal testing for operational, in there, I'd like to add a piece called analysis. And then where we are looking at how we are prioritizing the vulnerabilities that leads to the schedule, we also want to deal with this piece as well, how we're prioritizing. So the reality is operational staff, they focus on applying the critical CVEs because they can't apply them all. And what happens is they leave this growing repository of medium and low vulnerabilities across the network. Now, many of us really aren't going to be concerned with the lows, but leftover highs and medium vulnerabilities tend to grow over time. And that's where we have the exposure that an attacker, once they find an entry point, start taking advantage of. And so the impact is the attackers can deeply penetrate a network, move laterally, find and exfiltrate data because they are leveraging these existing vulnerabilities. If you go look at some of our prior episodes, there's an episode where 3 Microsoft vulnerabilities were used in combination. Neither one of them was a critical, and neither one of them alone was, was seen to be dangerous to the network or exploitable in and of itself. They were little things like, privilege escalation, but in combination, the 3 of them, the attackers owned the box, right? So this is what I'm talking about. So this is what I think is a representation of a better process. The analysis should be used to identify the exploitable vulnerabilities that exist in your environment. And then that helps you set the priorities so that you change the impact. So as I go a little bit further into this, we'll talk a little bit more what I mean by exploitable vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that we're looking at include things like missing patches. That's an easy one. You'll have things like it's outdated or unsupported. You might not think that's a concern, but if it's not being updated and it's outdated, it's not supported, you're also not being informed when new vulnerabilities or ways to leverage that in attack are being discovered, right? So that whole communication gets cut off. Then there's this third bullet here for weak configurations. What a lot of people do is they will use their SCAP scanners. So if you're new to the space, a SCAP scanner, SCAP, that's just a standard that all of the scanning vendors agreed to, that, and all that it means is that from the National Vulnerability Database, you can get these. The vendors also provide them, and the scanner manufacturers provide these. It's a standard file that's updated periodically that scanner consumes, and you use that to scan your network. And what it does is it creates exportable files, and those files are the list of all the vulnerabilities that were found. And what a lot of people will do is they'll look for the first couple of things. They'll look for missing patches, outdated, but they're not using these configuration settings to check their systems. And weak configurations are a substantial component in the type of exploitable vulnerabilities that attackers are leveraging. So if you are not doing that in your environments now, I encourage you, please, within your organization, start the conversation. You want to establish a standard baseline configuration that is hardened and that can then support the bulk of what your organization needs. This will get you a number of things. It will save you time and resources for updating because you'll have a standard image or 2 across your organization. Standardization lowers cost and makes maintenance and upkeep easier. And then in addition, you'll be able to use these configuration guides. Some people will call them STIGs, DISA, D-I-S-A, Department of Information Science at Department of Defense, puts out these configuration guides called STIGs, S-T-I-G-S. And those can also be used, they're in the standard format, loaded into the scanners and then used to scan your networks. When you use the configuration guides, you're not going to configure every setting, right? That would just lock the box so far that it becomes almost unusable. But you establish within your organization what that baseline is. So you're doing things like eliminating unnecessary services and applications. You're doing things like changing or eliminating weak authentication protocols. Microsoft has had at least 3 versions of those. So it's doing those kinds of things that really help close the doors and the windows so that the attackers don't have a surface to attack. They don't have a way, once they're in the network, they don't have a way to easily move laterally and compromise other systems. And then the last one, the API flaws. So I'm going to take just a minute and talk about this. I've been doing a lot of work lately in some of the supply chain risk area. And what organizations are finding across the board is that the more that they outsource and use different software components and like software as a service, cloud offerings, the more that they leverage a larger variety of offerings together, the more that they're actually finding an increase in revenue. And in a way that makes sense because it makes it easier for them to do more with less, right? So it makes sense from a business perspective, absolutely, to do that. Here's the problem. That drastically increases the complexity. And the more that you have complexity and the more APIs that you introduce, all of these are software. And so software inherently has a number of areas where it can be compromised, right? From the API to buffer overflows, if you're using any sort of SQL type language, the text strings and queries can often have vulnerabilities. The libraries that are used, right? So there is a plethora of areas within applications that can be compromised. So this issue is not going to go away. It's not going to get any better. It's going to increase, and it's going to increase exponentially. So that's why I put that one on the list. So these are the vulnerabilities that we're talking about that can make up this pool of exploitables. The goal of the analysis I'm talking about is to reduce the likelihood of a successful cyber attack by developing business processes for identifying, prioritizing, resolving, and reporting on vulnerabilities, right? That's kind of different than what we're doing right now, I think. In 2020, there were more than 18,000 vulnerabilities published on the National Vulnerability Database. That's just 2020, right? And you can go up and you can see every year's complete collection of vulnerabilities year by year by year. As software systems become more complex, the number of vulnerabilities are going to increase exponentially. We already talked about that. Think of it this way, vulnerabilities are risk. The more businesses rely on automation, the more important it is to be able to manage this vulnerability equals risk. Some of the benefits of doing the analysis that I'm talking about is going to reduce outages. It will lower the likelihood of a successful cyber attack. It will delay or eliminate an attacker's ability to move laterally, and it will decrease the time to discovery. How an organization approaches their vulnerability management says something about the maturity of their practices. As I was saying before, it's kind of in three buckets. You've got small to beginning to get mid-size, you've got the mid-size starting to get large, and then you have very large organizations. How they approach vulnerability management really says a lot about how far along they are in their security practices, how many policies and procedures they really have in place, whether or not they've selected and adopted a security standard like the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example. So as you're having these conversations in your organization, just kind of keep that in mind. This is not just an operations issue. Senior leadership should be involved in this. I know people say everybody in the organization plays a role, but there is a communication issue here around these security practices. When an organization reaches a size of complexity that it can no longer address all of the critical, high, and moderate vulnerabilities, then this kind of analysis would be my recommendation, because you're going to need something to help you prioritize the remediation. And CVSS scores alone are not enough. So when we talk about the analysis, how do we put this together? So what I'll get into in a little bit here is kind of the technical aspect of it, how it works, how the tagging occurs, that part of it. But here, I want you to bear in mind, when you're doing that work, after you've worked with the data, part of it really is about understanding what are your key assets, what's the critical data you have, where does it live in your organization, what are the essential functions. So by essential functions, this is where we start to have that conversation between leadership. We're not talking about, what I'm talking about here are those things that if the organization is attacked or something drastic occurs, these functions must continue. Other things can go by the wayside and the business can still exist. These must exist. And so part of what we're doing when we're talking about vulnerability analysis, and we're doing this, is really talking about building resilience within the organization by focusing on the essential functions and making sure that they are locked down, that the analysis we're performing ensures that they have all the security that they need and that they get it first, is what helps build that resilience across the organization. Another focal point here is the perimeter defense. I think everybody goes for that one, like, we get that. Make sure, you know, firewalls and routers are patched first. And then targeted systems. So what I mean by targeted systems, anything that is internet facing, right? So all of your internet facing websites, application servers, and in order to really understand what could be a targeted system, you also kind of have to have your architecture diagram, and you kind of have to understand the data flows in and out of your network. And they're going to be, the bigger your network gets, the more data flow that there are within your network. And the other interesting thing is, as the size of your network changes, the focus changes. So if you're a very small company, your endpoints, especially in now the time of COVID and everyone's working remotely, those endpoints are really highly targeted systems, right? And this is something that when I talk to small and medium-sized businesses, a lot of times they really don't quite get that point. That those workstations, those laptops, right, are really exposed. And then as the organization grows and you begin having more servers and there are more applications that are connected to the internet, and you have more partners that you're doing things with and you're sharing information, there's more data flow, then the list of what these targeted systems are shifts, right? And so you start seeing more servers come in and they're more dispersed in our architecture. So that's what you want to have as you start thinking about this analysis, because if you don't know the key assets, you don't know the critical data, you're not going to be able to really get the prioritization right. And a lot of these on this list, this is part of what you need to have conversation with leadership. And leadership needs to make the decision and decide what this priority is, right? So when we look at the analysis piece, we're going to be looking at exploitable vulnerabilities. But the other half of that is you have to know which systems those exploitable vulnerabilities exist on, because together that's how you make the prioritization. If I have an exploitable vulnerability and it's on an internal box that's used for development, it's not connected to anything, I probably don't care about it, right? But if that's connected to an essential function system and it has critical data on it, then my priority for that is going to change, right? I think we talked about this already a little bit about the fact that this process helps build resilience because it shifts the focus. It also aligns the IT work. It aligns cybersecurity with business priorities. And that's another conversation that we could have, that Industries are beginning to realize that you can no longer have cyber in a separate silo. You really don't have anything in your business that is not connected to the internet, that doesn't have internet-facing ports or protocols or data transfer. So I keep saying it, this really has to be a conversation that you elevate to leadership. And using this conversation, you're building resilience, you're saving money because you're going to be able to control the resources that are involved. I hope that helps when you start having these conversations. How the organization prioritizes is very close to risk analysis, and the two are interlinked. So the vulnerability analysis we're doing, the prioritization is very close to an organizational risk analysis. In a way, that's what you're doing. I don't know that many people think of it that way. I think many people think of it as a maintenance item. It's really not. You're really getting an organizational wide view on risk every time you do this, especially if you do this type of analysis and you're reporting this up, and you're not just talking about the numbers, but you're talking about the risk to the systems, to the data. This is a different conversation. That's kind of what I want, what I kind of want to get across, is this is a way to elevate the work. It's a way to align it with the business. And it's a way, if done right, that really has a substantial impact on lowering risk and lowering that attack surface. So some of the typical considerations that people look at now are, is it a false positive? Yes or no? Will it break my system? Yes or no? And these are important questions, but I think the vulnerability analysis piece is a different level of importance. So that analysis should have this risk component that I'm talking about, and this should be something that you're having a conversation with leadership. You're elevating the conversation, you're aligning this with the business priorities, and you're getting leadership to understand this isn't just a count of numbers of how busy you've been. You're really doing a risk analysis. If you do it right, you're really doing a risk analysis. So how likely is it that this vulnerability will be leveraged by an attacker? How would it be leveraged? And what's the potential impact of exploitation? These are the questions that you add to your analysis that takes it to the next level. Does that make sense? I'm trying to get you beyond counting the numbers and taking it to the next level. And when you do this and leadership understands, they're going to appreciate this. I'm telling you, I've done this. It makes a substantial difference. They will get it. And you will see numbers drop, and not just drop for that month and come back up. They will drop and they will stay down here. It's measurably, you can measure the difference in this. Most organizations don't do the analysis on the exploitability, and they leave those in the environment because they think, oh, my perimeter defense will cover me, I'm okay. Well, they couldn't get in. And you'll hear all these explanations for why the vulnerabilities I'm going to show you aren't a priority. So if you have a good program and you're moving up that level of maturity, you'll start to have some of these characteristics. You will have roles across the organization that are involved in the vulnerability management. You will have reporting that flows up, you're tracking and you're trending, and the management goals and priorities will start to flow down through policies and procedures. And this is part of, as I said, elevating that conversation and shifting away from counting numbers of patches every month and turning it into something that leadership can really understand and use in the organization. And once you can demonstrate this, there is true appreciation in the organization for the work. And it will no longer be a maintenance task. Instead, it becomes, in line with what the business is doing. And so I know you've probably seen this chart before, and this is, the typical triangle chart for good vulnerability management, where you've got the priorities are set at the top, you've got good procedures in between, and you've got reporting that flows both ways. So this is just a recap of the never-ending cycle. You have to evaluate, go through the prioritizing. That's where the analysis part exists. And then from that, you'll generate the content for your reports that come back up. And then that drives more evaluation. And it just becomes this cycle that is repeated over and over again. So now let's talk a little bit about the vulnerability analysis. There are a few steps in the process. Number one, we already talked about getting the organizational priorities so that you already have in your hands, you have your architectural diagram. You already know what the most important systems are that are the priority to the business. You know what functions are the priority to the business, right? You know where the critical data lives, right? So you already have that. Now you're going to get your vulnerability data. We talked about using the scanners, and it's going to produce that. The output that it gives you, and they all have different formats, but what you're looking for is the CDS, comma delimited, which you're going to pull into Excel. And then from that data you pull in, you're going to grab a couple of fields I'm going to show you, and that's what you're going to drop into the tool. So you're going to get the vulnerability data. With the tool, you're going to do this custom tagging. And then that's the first step in analyzing the exploitability. And then from that, you can produce your reports. So senior leadership, as I said, should establish the priorities for protection and response, as well as the acceptable level of risk. And that means in a quantified way, not qualitative. So what I mean by that is, in this tool, when you do the analysis, you will be quantifying this risk. When we quantify risk, we take it from these qualitative labels like high, very high, you know, it's kind of sort of this touchy-feely, and we put numbers to the data. And that's what you're going to do in this analysis. You will be quantifying that data. Leadership needs to, and you can start this conversation with them, leadership needs to quantify what is that acceptable level of risk, that risk appetite, what is that? Until they put numbers to it, it's still vague, and you can end up easily having more risk in the organization than what you really want. So that's another piece of the conversation you should start having with leadership as you start doing this work. So we talked a little bit about the SCAP, SCAP, the SCAP scanners. Most organizations do this monthly. And it depends what the, what you have in your organization, when the patches come out, when you decide to do it. And then you're going to import that data into Excel. The same method that we use for the tagging is the same sort of method that AI uses, except this isn't big AI, this is little AI, this is Excel. And the reason that I like this is because it's accessible. The data that you're getting is going to be right in an Excel format. You can drop it in. Excel is easy enough for anyone to learn, and it's really great for doing all the charting and all of the other things. It just really makes a really good platform for doing this work. As we go along, I'll show you some of the exploitable keywords. When you go through and do the tagging, you'll probably do this in a couple of swipes. So what I tend to do is I'll look at my data and I'll say, I want to first look at the vulnerabilities by vendor, right? So like everybody's got Microsoft, Cisco, VMware, right? So first you look by vendors. You can also do by applications. If you want to break Microsoft down, you can look for like Word, Excel, right? Or you could use other characteristics like outdated, unsupported, right? So you can look for characteristics that are important to you, and then you can use the exploitable keywords. So the exploitable keywords are things that over time, I have seen, and just over in fact, I was counting up today, like I wonder how many lines of vulnerabilities I've probably looked at, and it's something in the realm of 30 million. So in that time, you kind of notice some trends. So these keywords, and this is just a list, a short list, there's some others, things like denial of service, code execution, privilege escalation, authentication, access control, and known exploitability, right? So these keywords, there's a standard sort of list that all the vendors use. And that content is in the vulnerability description, and they all describe things similarly. And so that's where we're going to go and grab this and do this tagging piece. So a quality vulnerability analysis supports further quantitative analysis. And what I mean by that is what we're going to do in this analysis will become data for other quantitative analysis that you can do, because you are quantifying the vulnerability in your organization, right? And you've had this data. Most organizations, like I said, just don't look at it this way, and they just haven't used it this way because they're not doing the quantitative work. This will support things like an estimate for the likelihood of a successful attack, perimeter or control strength. You can apply it to that. You can apply it to an organizational risk like supply chain risk, and you can also then add to that the impact. So it's collecting, preparing, analyzing the data. You get that for reports, and then you're going to use this in other analysis that you will do. You can take the data, you can make all kinds of charts. The analysis itself is very rapid, and I do mean very rapid. I work on very large data sets. You should have 64-bit operating system. Make sure you have the 64-bit version of Excel installed. If you don't, you're not going to be able to do this kind of analysis. And that's another thing that always surprised me, that people just have a 32-bit version of an application on a 64-bit operating system. But do that, and this will go really quickly for you. And so you're going to associate numbers with categories like systems, equipment type, location, office, however it makes sense to organize it in your environment. Okay, I'm going to take a minute here and let's see if we have any questions. I'll go to the Q&A. Okay, no questions yet? Great. I'm going to go ahead then and go to the demonstration that I have for you. Great. Let me bring that up. Okay, great. This is what the data tagging tool, vulnerability analysis tool is that we have. As I said, it's an Excel format. I'm just going to walk you through this and explain a few things. So all of our tools are kind of laid out the same, where you've got the information helper text at the top to kind of step you through. In this one, we've given you a couple of things, and I just kind of want to explain a little bit about the model, and then I'll take you into the tagging and how that part works. So we have a summary at the top that just gives you a breakdown of whatever data you've put in, your critical, your high, your moderates, and all that kind of thing. So we give you some nice little statistics at the top. So that could be a snippet that goes into a reporting piece. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit the way this is laid out. There, now you can kind of see the whole thing. The yellow on the left is data input, the way we colorize things. Anything that's in that pale yellow, that's data input. And then everything in the white over here is kind of the engine of the tool. And so what we've given you, I think I pulled, I'm going to zoom back in so you can see what we're looking at. So I went to the National Vulnerability Database and I pulled, I think, 100 items here from 2018 data sets. You'll see these are all 2018 and then numbered. So those are the CVE numbers. And you can use the CVE as your ID number. If you're using a SCAP tool that uses plugin IDs, you can use that too. It's up to you, whatever you want to use for that field, either one. The next field over is the vulnerability description. I'm going to open this up so that you can see. This is the text explanation that the vendors provide every time they put one of these together. And then the next field is the severity in text, and then the number of findings. Now, you'll see here the number of findings. What we're looking at here is summary data from one of these reports, not the detailed data on a single system. If you're a very small organization, you could get a SCAP scanner they have some that are free, they're no cost. They have some that are open source, no cost for small environments. And you could do that if you wanted to, but this is more, this is the summary data, and that's why you have counts of findings. I just put random numbers in here to give us a demonstration. So this is where the kind of the magic happens on the right-hand side. So what you'll do is using your keywords, whatever you're looking for, and you'll put them across the top row here. So in this case, I've got Juniper and Cisco. So if I were to continue and put like Microsoft and I don't know, Apache and I don't know, some Unix flavors in there, maybe I'm then just using this to look at my vulnerabilities by vendor. Makes sense? So I put all the vendors across the top and it would execute. Or I could use things like DOS, which is short for denial of service. Or I might say unauthenticated, or I would use malicious, in which case now I'm looking for exploitable vulnerabilities, right? So each time you run this, you'll run it in batches. Maybe the first time you want to tag your data by vendor or software, or you want to tag it by an exploitable set of keywords, whatever you're looking at, right? So we'll switch real quick. So Word has 7. So you saw how quickly that went. I've used this same type of tool on data sets with thousands, up to 5,000, and you'll still see it execute very well. Now, another thing about this particular tool, and all of these are included in our courses, and they are working documents for educational purposes, but they're fully formed tools. They all function. But if you wanted one that was bigger than 100 lines, we give you the ability to do that, and I'll show you. So in our models, we expose you to the Excel formulas so that you can actually take this and replicate. If you wanted 1,000, you could just put it out, drag it down, make 1,000 rows. You can now process 1,000 entries at a time. So we give you everything to take what we teach you, and so that you can take it to the next level yourself. Does that make sense? Because one of the reasons that I started all of this, as I said, I think in the beginning, I had to make tools for myself. And I know that there is not a repository out there for these kinds of tools. And it can be a real struggle for someone to kind of take the time and figure out how to do this. It's not easy. If you're not an Excel whiz, to try and figure out some of these things, and certainly for the quantifying tools, that's a whole other level of complexity there, right? So it's not only the tool, you have to have something that actually can generate it beyond what Excel has built into it, and then there's all the math that goes into it. So those also aren't easy. So this is what it looks like. This is why I created. This is kind of how it works. And then over here on the other side, what it gives you is a concatenated list so that it looks nice. You have commas and spaces in between, and then you can take the numbers and the values you have across the top. You can pull those out, and you can take your numbers here. You pull these out. You can take the whole thing, do a pivot table on the whole thing. You can really do some nice reporting from the tool. Another thing that is just kind of nice that we give everybody is a trending tab in the back that just allows you to pick whatever the key metrics are that you want. And you could do it by month, you could do by quarter, it doesn't matter. It's just a flexible tool for you, and it will give you a line and a bar chart that, again, something you can use in your conversation and take that, pull that out. You can drop it into slides for presentation or brief. You can put it into a report. So I'm going to pause here again for a moment and let's see if we have any other questions coming up. Okay. So there's one more thing that I wanted to share with you really quick, and then there's some other items that I wanted to discuss real quick. So let me bring up. Great. Okay. Okay, so the last little thing that I wanted to share with you is a document. And let me quickly grab this so that I can put it into, let me stop sharing for a moment so that I can get this and give you the URL for this. Here we go. Great. Now I can drop this in the chat and you will have this. Awesome. There. Now, what I wanted to do, I'm going to go back and share that again so we can talk about it. Great. So you can download that. What I wanted to do was let you know that we have this out on the website, and it was a guide that my team put together for vulnerability analysis to kind of go along with this episode. And in here, we put together 8 steps for vulnerability analysis and kind of improving your vulnerability work that you're doing. And so I'll take you down. Here it is. So here's where the 8 steps are. So I wanted to give you that so you could go ahead and download that and go through the 8 steps, and you have that information. But the other thing that I wanted to share with you real quick, I'm going to zoom down to the bottom of the document. Way down here at the bottom, we've got 2 nice bonuses for you, and I'll zoom in so you can see this. So we're giving you 50% off of the tool that I just showed you. And to get that, when you go to the website and you go to the tools and training, and I can show you that if you like, when you register for the class, use that whole snippet there. It'll ask you for a discount code. If you put that in, it'll change the price automatically and cut that in half. And then we're also giving you 20% off the PR Mod for Cyber. PR Mod for Cyber is a framework that I've created. It includes this model as well as many others. It includes the FAIR model. I don't know if you've heard about that. FAIR model is the international, in fact, there's only one, international standard for quantifying risk, and it associates financial impacts to risk. And it includes the PR mod includes all of the FAIR components in there as well. It also includes components for doing things like organizational risk, quantifying risk when you're doing desktop exercises, using scenarios to quantify the risk of any kind of cyber attack. We also have a model in there that works with the techniques and tactics from the MITRE ATT&CK model, if you've heard of that. The MITRE ATT&CK model is a community de facto standard that people have been contributing to document advanced persistent threat groups, the techniques and tactics that they use. And this model uses that same life cycle flow and allows you to analyze the probability of an attack given your environment, and a number of other models. Anyway, so I wanted to make sure you had some discounts in there and some information. And then I'm going to stop here and we'll go to some of the questions. Okay, so one question, where can you get these? Yes, so on the website, if you go to physmax.com, right up on the top, you will see 2 menus. One is called Tools and Training. If you go into Tools and Training, that page will start to describe for you all the tools that are available. And from there, there's a link that you can get more information about each of those. And then from there, you can go to the learning platform and you can preview the course. You can actually look at some of the content before you even register. So you can check out what's it look like, what are the training videos look like, and you can get all that information. And then when you're ready, you can register there. And as soon as you register, you'll be granted immediate access to all the content. And then what we're going to start doing is having monthly industry days and bringing people together and having workshops. So it's a continuous learning process. It's not like some online training is just very static. Ours is constantly being updated and added to, and we're trying to build a community around these tools to give people reasonable tools and inexpensive tools, yet very powerful tools so that they can start doing this work. Because I've been in the industry almost 30 years, and these problems aren't going to go away. And everyone is struggling with them. They are going to continue to increase exponentially. There have been more in 2021, a fourfold increase in a quarter. And so we as a community need, I feel, we need to do as much as we can to make these tools, and that's what I'm doing, trying to make these tools accessible so those of us involved in this work can provide better information to leadership so they can make decisions. Because here's one of the key things that I see over and over and over again. We go in, we see the risk, we try to express that risk, and the best that we can do is say, hey boss, bad stuff happened, more bad stuff is going to happen, because we can't quantify it. But when we quantify it, then we can have a conversation that says, well, based on the data I have available, it looks like we have a 75 to 85% probability of a successful attack in the next 6 months, which would have an impact to operations, and it would alter our ability to deliver our products to our clients. That would probably result in a financial impact of between 50,000 to 150, or whatever the dollar amount is, right? That's a different conversation. Management can make a decision now. Does that make sense? That really is the difference we're talking about. Anyway, so that's where you can find them, and you can go there and check on them. And like I said, we tend to put out discounts like this. So if you keep up with what we're doing and keep coming back to the website and keep checking up on what we're doing. And if you have any questions, our contact information is there. You can reach out to me as well. It's Charlene@bizmax.com. It's real easy. Oh, okay, so here's one. How do the exploitable keywords relate to other models or standards? That's a really good question. So as I explained, I saw over the years of doing this work that there were clearly descriptions that were being used consistently by the vendors, and I could use them to tag my data and make my work much faster, and it allowed me to present my work in a much better way. I did some work with the MITRE ATT&CK, which MITRE ATT&CK is organized around the attack lifecycle. And then within that, it associates all the techniques and tactics that the advanced persistent threat groups would use. In there, you will find trends, the same kind of trends I was seeing in my data. And then also, if you're familiar with OWASP, O-W-A-S-P, this is also a community organization that over the years has really become a de facto standard. And what they have done is they have created for themselves, all with user community input. They put out a set of like the top 10 software controls, right? So they are working to formalize what they see in the community. And they have an extensive amount of data there, which if you haven't found them yet, go look them up, O-W-A-S-P, OWASP. And they talk about not only the kinds of vulnerabilities, but as programmers, if you can stop or change your code up here, it prevents any of these other attacks from ever being able to occur. And that's kind of the same thing that this vulnerability analysis is doing. By identifying the exploitables in your network, what will happen is you'll have a level of patching numbers that are up here, and you'll patch and they'll come back up, and you patch and they come back up, and it just becomes a cycle, and you report it over and over and over again. But yet it's in this range. It never really goes out of this range. Once you do this type of analysis, and you might do it for 2 or 3 quarters, over the course of a year, you'll do this, you'll see these numbers drop to a level, and they never go up that high again, because you have eliminated some of the core problems, like the configuration errors. And now you're counting much smaller numbers. The process continues, but you have substantially changed your attack surface. And this is the only way that I know to do this. So yes, there is a correlation there. It is not a direct correlation. It is a correlation just by the sheer fact of most vulnerabilities come from applications. MITRE also tends to track it because that's what's being leveraged. We see it in this tool because it's in the descriptions. So yes, there is a correlation there. Another question, is there a use limit? No. When I first started to develop these tools, I thought a lot about whether I wanted to do this as a cloud product. And I have some pretty strong feelings about whether I would want to put my vulnerability data in the cloud, right? So I didn't go that direction. And I liked the idea that a spreadsheet was light, portable, easy to use, very familiar. So no, there's no use limitation. Once you have purchased it, you have it, you've gone through the course, you've downloaded those files, you're free to use them as many times as you need them. And I encourage you to use them. How much of an impact is, okay, yeah, so I was talking about that a minute ago. I have seen it cut numbers 50%. That is substantial. And once you go through the process and you've done it, those numbers will drop, and then you'll continue to do the work, but you just won't be able to find as many vulnerabilities because you've addressed the core issue at that point. But you'll continue to do the work, and then you'll start finding different things. Other things of concern will pop up out of the data. And so those might be some of the other characteristics, like unsupported, or finding applications that are installed in your environment that shouldn't be there. Once the bulk has been removed, then all of these other odds and end things will start to pop up, which sometimes can also be little pieces that can be, as substantial a risk as anything else. Okay, so it looks like that's our time. I do tend to be a bit of a chatterbox. So I'm going to say thank you for your time. If you have any questions, again, don't forget to go look at the YouTube channel. There's a ton of really useful information over there, and go check out the tools and training. And if you have any questions, my contact information is online. And if you want to set up some time with me to go over anything, we have a contact page and you can get on my calendar. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.